Over the first two chapters, Habakkuk has raised his complaints with God about the inaction on evil, firstly within Israel, and then on the Chaldeans who were to bring God's judgment on Israel. But despite Habakkuk's confrontational ways, God never rebukes him. Instead, God provides a word of comfort. He has seen, he knows, he is going to act, and he will be completely just in all that he does. So how does Habakkuk respond to all of this? Well, this short book ends in chapter 3 with a final prayer of Habakkuk that is remarkably different in tone from his earlier two prayers. Firstly, notice in verse 1, this is a prayer of Habakkuk according to Shigionoth. Now, what on earth is Shigionoth? Well, while we don't know exactly what this means, it seems to be a musical direction of some kind, like a particular tune or a way of singing. But what we do know is that this is a final prayer, a poem of sorts by Habakkuk. And then if you skip down and notice at the very end of this book, we have this strange line, "To the choir master with stringed instruments." Among many other unusual things about this book, this last chapter seems to have been written as a kind of poem or psalm to be used in the community of God's people. It is a prayer to sing together in the midst of adversity. Stringed instruments were associated with triumphant songs of joy, which will also help for us to read this whole prayer as a surprisingly joyful reflection on what has been a very difficult topic throughout. And also of note is the word Selah, which appears in verse 3, in verse 9, and verse 13. It's a word that often appears in the books of Psalms, and you might be surprised to know that no one actually knows what this word means. It seems to be a musical instruction of some kind, again, and it only appears in songs, but that's about all we know about this word. But the fact that this whole chapter is written as a prayerful song for the community of God's people is a very important point for understanding this whole book. Although we have been reading this book as a conversation between Habakkuk and God, Habakkuk is quite literally a spokesman for the whole community. These are not just Habakkuk's complaints. They are the complaints of the people of God. And Habakkuk is the prophet who speaks on their behalf to God. Habakkuk begins in verse 2, which acts like an introduction to the rest of this chapter. Habakkuk says that he has heard the report that God has presented of his work. This is a reference back to chapter 1, verse 5, when God said there, God, I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe. And Habakkuk has heard all that God has said, and his natural response is to fear. The concept of hearing and fearing is one that is repeated in Deuteronomy as an appropriate response to God's word. You'll find examples of this in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 13, chapter 19, verse 20, and 21, verse 21, among others. The response of fear is that awe of facing something far greater than you could imagine, which is exactly how Habakkuk should feel about facing God's surprising and confronting plans to use the Chaldeans to bring judgment on Israel. He is both afraid and in awe of the size and completeness of God's plan. Habakkuk asks God to do three things: to revive it, make it known, and remember mercy. These three lines are in parallel, which will help us unpack the meaning here, and we can divide the lines up in this way. Now, what is the it in these phrases? To revive it, make it known. Well, revive it is a way of saying make it live, bring it back to life. It's another reference to chapter 2, verse 4. The righteous shall live. And this is like Habakkuk calling out to live and stand in the face of the judgment that God will bring. Make it known recalls chapter 2, verse 14, where God says, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. And this is why the third line in these parallel statements makes it very clear what he is asking. Remember mercy. Remember mercy by allowing me to live in the face of judgment and in the presence, the glory of the Lord, glory meaning presence. And so the first half of each of these phrases is speaking about this coming judgment at the hands of the Chaldeans in the midst of years, which means in this time, in this season, as this comes, in this wrath that will come for evil and sin. The word translated wrath here is used 4 times in this passage, but in the other 3 places it's translated tremble. You'll see it in verse 7 and then twice in verse 16. It's the same word in all of these verses. And we should read it here in verse 2 as that kind of fear and trembling that comes from facing the judgment that God is about to bring on Israel. So you see in this verse, Habakkuk has begun to accept what God is about to do. And he simply seeks God's mercy and for God to remember his covenant. And notice again twice he uses God's covenantal name, which is translated as Lord in all capitals, Yahweh. From verses 3 to 15, Habakkuk does some remembering of his own now. He's asked God to remember, and now he reflects and remembers God's actions of the past. And we'll walk through this fairly quickly and clarify a few terms along the way as best we can. God came from Teman, which is a reference to Edom. Edom was the nation that descended from Esau, where his brother Jacob was the father of Israel, and Edom lies just to the east of Israel, adjacent to it. And we have the Holy One from Mount Paran, which is a reference to the kind of the region of Sinai, which is where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Now, these 2 phrases are about God revealing himself both through Jacob as opposed to Esau and through the law, the 10 Commandments. And this is reinforced again in the next phrases in verses 3 and 4, which echo this idea about God revealing himself and being identified by himself. In verses 5 to 7, it speaks of God's role in bringing justice and judgment on the earth. Pestilence and plague are simply words that capture the idea of judgment. We get this sense of God's justice as he stood and measured in order to bring the appropriate level of justice. The mention of nations emphasizes that God's judgment is over all the world, and In Israelites' history, they have seen this particularly in the surrounding nations, which are Cushan and Midian. And notice again here there is the reminder of trembling that comes from seeing and experiencing God's judgment and justice. Now, from verses 8 to 15, Habakkuk begins to now address God personally. And he starts speaking using the words you and your. And again, the use of Lord shows that Habakkuk is now remembering God's personal involvement in humanity, and especially the people of Israel. There is a lot of language here about creation, you might notice. There are rivers and seas, mountains, the sun and moon. All of this is highlighting very poetically God's power over all of these things in creation. And in between these mentions of creation, we have this alternating image of God's power. We have his horses, his chariots of salvation. These are depictions of an army. And we have the bow and arrows, and the arrows and spears, the marching against the nations. All army kind of language, which recalls chapter 2, verse 13, where God was called the Lord of hosts, that image of an army. And this section culminates in this almost brutal image of God's power over evil. It says, "You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors. You trampled the sea with your horses." Habakkuk is reflecting on God's power to bring justice and judgment even over the worst evil and sin. And as powerful and scary as the Chaldeans are, they will be crushed under the weight of God's power and judgment and justice. And in fact, any evil, any wicked and sinful people will suffer the same fate. Of course, in the middle of all of this, Habakkuk also remembers God's faithfulness to his promises to his people. He brings not only justice but salvation. God's power is almost incomprehensible, and yet there is a great reason for Habakkuk to have hope, which is why Habakkuk cries out for God's mercy, because Habakkuk knows that God is faithful to his promises. And so we come to the final sentences of Habakkuk. He remembers God's powerful work in the past and his faithfulness to his promises. So what will it mean to live by faith? Well, firstly, Habakkuk is simply in awe. He has been put in his place, and he recognizes that God is far more powerful, wise, and just than he could imagine. And so he hears about the coming of the Chaldeans to bring God's judgment, and he trembles. His lips quiver. His legs give way. This is certainly not easy news to take. And just as the Chaldeans were silenced at the end of chapter 2, now Habakkuk himself is also silenced. He can do nothing except wait, fearfully, but patiently, for God's judgment to come. And trust that God will show mercy as he has also promised. There is an acceptance here that God knows what he is doing, even if it hasn't always made sense. It is clear that God has far bigger things in mind than Habakkuk. And Habakkuk's only appropriate response is to trust that God knows what he is doing. And so he finishes with this beautiful piece of poetry. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Here Habakkuk reflects that even if everything around him fails, even if he is surrounded only by the destruction that is about to come, he will rejoice. Now, for an agricultural society, this is a description of total devastation, and yet he will rejoice. Now, how and why? Well, because he will live. The righteous will live and survive judgment by faith. In the most devastating of circumstances, Habakkuk can rejoice because he knows that God's promises endure far beyond any present hardship. That even in the depths of the most unbelievable times, Habakkuk's only hope is to believe that God is good and faithful and will save his people. Of course, he will need God's help to do this, as he expresses in verse 19. Strangely here, God appears in all capitals, it's actually his name Yahweh again. Normally it gets translated as Lord in all capitals. But because the literal word Lord appears right next to it, which means master or sovereign, the translators have used the capital word God instead. Now, how will Habakkuk have faith? Well, only by drawing near to God and his promises. Only God will be able to help him to stand firm like a deer, even on the highest, rockiest mountain. And this is how the righteous will live. This is the only way anyone survives God's judgment. By our faith and trust in God to keep his promises, and by drawing near to him.